everyone, and welcome to the OklaRoots YouTube channel. In today's tutorial, we're gonna make a quilt block. It's not a bag. We're gonna make a quilt block. We don't do that a whole lot here anymore. We used to do it more often, but I'm trying to bring back quilting this year. I think we could all use a little bit more like simple fabric therapy, so today we're making a quilt block. Today we're making the OklaRoots pattern Magic Maker quilt block. Now, this pattern is written by me, and it's curvy. I know, and if you're a bag maker and not a quilter and you're like, maybe I'll give quilting a little bit of a try, and you're like, I'm gonna start with curves, I got you. You trusted me with bags, trust me with quilting, trust me with curves. I got you. I got a good technique for this because I'm gonna be honest with you, I've hated sewing curves on quilt blocks forever. I started quilting so many years ago, and I tried so many times to do these beautiful curves. I believe the name of this type of block is called like a drunkard's path. I think that's what it's called. I tried so many times, so many different patterns, so many different techniques, and it always came out bad. And it was so frustrating. But I think now with my experience with bag making, and my ability to sew something in a three-dimensional way instead of a two-dimensional way, which is quilting. Quilting is a very two-dimensional process. I feel like my brain can wrap around the process better, and I think I can explain it to you. I think you're gonna love this. Just, again, like I said, you trusted me with bags, trust me with this. So today we're gonna go through the pattern. I'm not gonna give you any of the measurements, so if you do wanna make this block, you're gonna have to buy the pattern. There are 3 sizes. So this is a size small, and there are printable pattern pieces for all the curvy bits and an optional bow applique, which we'll go through at the end of this video. And you guessed it, because there's printable templates, there's also gonna be acrylic templates, but you're not gonna have any printable or acrylic templates for the basic rectangles, okay? You're not gonna have that. So now let's look at the size medium. So here's the size medium, which is perfect for a tote bag, like perfect tote bag. And you can see this one, we did do the applique. That is quilt cotton appliqued on with raw edges, and it's not gonna fray. I got tricks you won't believe, guys, okay? So just stick with me, I'm gonna show you how I did that. Also, you can see on the background in this one, we do have a directional print. So I'm gonna explain to you how we work with the directional print, where you guys need to make sure you're paying attention. This is gonna actually be where the acrylic templates are really helpful, but we'll go through that. And let me just show you the difference between the small and the medium. So here's the difference between small and medium. And then, for those of you guys who wanna make a very cutesy quilt, but you don't wanna make 1,000 quilt blocks, I got you. Look at this one. This is a size large. This is comically big. This is a size large. I'm just saying, you make 9 of these blocks, you're gonna have a big old quilt, and then you're gonna take it on vacation with you. And I do have the bow applique template for this as well. So lots of options here. Let's see how this compares to the other 2 sizes. Let me see if I can get them all together. So here you go. Here are all 3 of the sizes. This is small, medium, and large. And they're fun. They're easy. I'm gonna say they're pretty easy. Quick-ish. The thing that's gonna take you the longest is just prepping and getting these rounded bits done. But like I said, I have a method, I have a technique. I have a technique that allows you to piece these rounded corners together and be real sloppy, and then we just clean it up. And nobody's ever gonna know that it wasn't perfect. That's my favorite type of everything. It doesn't have to be perfect every single step. It's just gonna be perfect in the end. So if you're new to the OklaRoots YouTube channel, please consider clicking subscribe down below. If you're a total newbie quilter and you're like, that's a little too adventurous for me, I actually have an entire quilt made up of 12 different designs of blocks. I think there's even more than that. It was with the OklaRoots block party. I'll have that linked in this tutorial up in the corner and also down below in the description. Those blocks are fantastic for beginners. I don't believe we had any curves whatsoever. So it's all just straight line stitching. Nothing weird, nothing overwhelming. But I think you can do this. I think you can make the curves. I'm just telling you, this is a process I've hated for so long. And I was just determined. I was like, I want to make beautiful blocks with curves. And I want to not hate doing it. So I'm a very stubborn person, and I figured out a way that works for me, and hopefully it'll work for you too. All right, guys, let's get started. Okay, so let's go through all the tools first, and then we'll go through the pattern pieces. First, with quilting, you're gonna need an iron. Iron is essential here, so I have my iron and my pressing mat. Ironing board is fine too, it's just pressing mat's easier for me. And then I have a mister bottle. Now here's the thing, this iron is a steam iron, like most irons are. However, I find that water damages iron so quickly. every time I've had an iron and I've put water in it and used the steam function, they just don't last very long. Once I stop putting water in irons, they've lasted a lot longer. So I still like the steam effect, and it helps with a lot of these seams. So instead what I do is I have a misting bottle. So it's not like a spray bottle, it's a mist. And I just mist my fabric and then I iron it. I'll show you how I do that. And then you're gonna want some pins. Now I prefer these really fine pins versus these like standard thicker pins. I don't know if you can tell, but there is a difference between these two. I'll link the fine pins down below. I find that the thinner pins just work better with quilting. Next, my thread of choice is a cotton thread, which might be shocking to you if you see my bag making videos, but for quilt blocks, I do suggest you use cotton thread. You can also use the polyester Gutermann thread, that's fine as well. Just don't use anything that's really thick. This is a 50 weight Aurifil thread, I believe. You want thin, light thread to go with your thin, light material. And then the needle I like to use is a Microtech 7010. Anything thicker than that, like an 80-12 or a 90-14, is just gonna be way too thick for your material. I have a 1" by 6" ruler as always, a rotary cutter because we will be trimming down blocks as we work here, an erasing marker, and a chalk pen. I have labels here. Now that's the thing with quilting. When you're making quilt blocks, typically there are a lot of rectangles that are very similar in size, and it can be difficult to remember what goes where. So we always label our quilt blocks. I like to use letters in my patterns, so I have letter labels to help with that. And then to help keep them organized, I have this adorable little tray here, because why not? And then when we work on the bow, I am going to be using this Hot Fix adhesive. Now this is really cool, and it's totally optional and different. But it's a way to kind of make quilt cotton a raw edge material, which is not, right? We're gonna go over that. Again, totally optional. You don't have to use it at all. Not necessary for the quilt block, but it's fun to play with. And then finally, the templates. We're gonna go through all these templates in detail, but the template sets are available for all sizes. For small, medium, and large size, they are sold separately. They are a set of 7 templates. You're gonna have everything you need to make the block, and you're also going to have the bow applique template. So we'll go over that in just a moment. All right, so for templates today, you really have only 4 main templates for the block. And then the rectangle pieces down here, they do not have templates. You have 2 extra templates that are for sizing and trimming down your block so that the pattern piece comes out perfectly. And then you have an applique template for the bow, which is optional. So let's go through this. Pattern piece A are going to be your cuts for your ear. You're going to have 6 cuts total, 3 for each ear. And use the pattern piece, either the acrylic one or the printable one for that. Pattern piece B is going to be for the outline, the outer portion of that ear. So when we combine A and B together, it's going to result in a square. Yeah, I know. Curves, don't be scared of curves. You're gonna do great today. Pattern piece C are going to be 2 cuts of this curved template for the face, and then pattern piece D are going to be the outer pieces of that face piece, and these are going to be the outside areas, and when we combine C and D together, we will get a square. So from pattern piece A, you'll have 6 cuts. From pattern piece B, you'll have 6 cuts. C and D are both 2 cuts each. From pattern piece E, you'll have 2 cuts. These are for the inner portion of your ears. They're rectangles. Pattern piece F, you're going to have 1 ear and 1 background material. This is going to be for the very center of the top of the head. Pattern piece G is going to be 2 of your face cuts. And these are going to be just below the ears, but above the curve of the bottom of the face. And pattern piece H is going to be the background material. You'll have 2 cuts of that, and they're going to go on the sides of the block. Now, for this applique, I'm going to use a red quilt cotton material, and I'm going to use that Hot Flex, but we're going to do that at the very end. So I'm going to set this to the side. And then these last 2 templates are a part of the acrylic set, but they're not a part of the printable set. I will show you how to have the same result as using these if you did not buy the template set. So if you're just using the printables and a ruler, I am going to show you what you need to do to achieve the same look, but these are very, very easy. So if you're going to be making a lot of these quilt blocks, acrylic templates are always really helpful for that. So I am all about efficiency. So I'm going to start with the curves first. I'm going to do all the curved combos right up back to back. So when you're laying this out, if you have a directional print, think about that now, okay? So we're gonna have 1 ear that's just like this on the left, and then another ear that's just like this on the right, all right? And I don't know why I have an extra one of these, I shouldn't. And then your outside pieces are gonna go just like this. So use those templates to make sure you consider your pattern placement if you have a directional print. And then I'm gonna lay out the bottom as well. And this is just, I just lay this out to begin with. As you can see, I don't have any directional print with this material, so it does not matter what ends up where. But if you do have a directional print, lay this out first to get an idea of how you want it to be. For example, here's the medium size quilt block, and you can see that my background material is a directional print. So I was very thoughtful of that when I cut out every single pattern piece to make sure the direction was the way I wanted it to be. That's the nice thing about printable templates, is that you have a lot of control over that. So just take your time to figure that out. All right, so if you laid this out like this and you have a directional print, I suggest using your phone or camera and just take a picture of it if that's exactly where you want everything, so you don't forget, because now we're gonna start lining everything up. So I'm just going to lay my little combo pieces together and stack them up. Again, it doesn't matter for me what's where, but if it does for you, make sure you keep everything together. And so I'll just use this one here as an example. Now, this is what I find easiest to do. Take your background piece B and fold it right sides together so the short little edges come together. And what we're doing is we're finding the midpoint on the inner curve here. So just very carefully, don't stretch anything, don't tug on anything, just very carefully line it up and then push down on that center bit where the midpoint is, grab your iron and just right on the edge, not the whole thing, just on the edge, give it a little press. That's gonna mark our midpoint. If you wanna use a marking tool, you can, that's fine. So for the earpiece, we're gonna go wrong sides together. So for the outer background, we did right sides together. The earpiece, we're gonna go wrong sides together, and we're focused on the midpoint on the curved outer edge. So line up your corners, give it a fold, and then press right on that edge to mark that midpoint. All right, so can you see we now have like little folds to help us? We're gonna grab our pins. So then take your background piece with the curved like a smile, just like that. So background piece is right side up, curve is smiling. Take your earpiece and lay it right side down, frowning, okay? Happy background, sad ear. Think of that. They're opposites, smile, frown. And using those midpoint marks, line them up just like that. This is what it should look like. It's almost like a frown with a mustache, right? Okay, so line those up where the midpoints match up, folded together, and then grab a pin, a nice skinny one, not a thick one, and pin at that midpoint. There we go. Easy peasy, right? Now, I'm gonna flip this over so I'm looking at the wrong side of the background piece. I'm gonna take this short edge here and I'm gonna twist this around so that the flat part of that short edge matches up with the long flat part of my piece A. And I'm just going to line it up corner to corner, straight edge to straight edge, okay? That's all I'm focused on right now. Don't worry about the rest of it. Just those corners and the straight edges. And then use a pin to pin those together, just like that. If this is your first time working with curves like this, it can seem a little messy, especially if you're a quilter. It's like everything's always really flat and nice and neat. And this is like, it's three-dimensional, what am I doing? You got this. So we're gonna do the same thing on the right side. We're gonna twist that piece B short edge over so it's flat side to flat side with piece A and corner to corner. Remember, your short piece B edge is not lining up with the curved part of A, it's lining up with the flat side of A. And we're gonna use a pin to hold that in place. Pins are very important. So this is what you should have now. It kind of looks like a little sloppy mess and you're like, how the heck is this gonna go together? Honestly, if you just give it like a quick little flip, you'll see it's gonna go together just like that and it's gonna be perfect. So I like to add one more pin between each of these. So I'm gonna flip this back out. And what I'm gonna do now is we're gonna get stretchy, okay? Because the way we cut the material, we're pretty much cutting it on the bias, but these curves are stretchy. So I can kind of pull a little bit. So I'm not flattening it. If we've made bags with gussets, remember we have the wall and it has to go up and around. So like we have the bowl and we have the wall. If you've made the gussets, you know what I'm talking about. We're doing the same thing here. The A piece, the ear piece is kind of like the bowl, and the B piece, the outline, the outer background ear piece is like the wall. So we're just gonna tuck in that A piece as best we can. And if you try to flatten it out, it's gonna be all ripply, but we don't need to flatten it out. We want it just like this, see? And I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side, just kind of tugging, pulling. If it's a little bubbly, that's okay. As long as you cut everything out using the pattern pieces, it's all gonna come together real nicely at the sewing machine. All right, so you see, this is what we have. It looks like a mess, but it's okay. If at any point you kind of pull, you should be able to straighten out that section. On its own, it's all bubbly, but when I go between these two pins and give it a tug, it's nice and straight. The next two pins, nice and straight. Because that's at the sewing machine what we're gonna do. We're just gonna straighten it out as we sew. And then make sure the corners are all lined up, midpoints are good. Repeat that with your other 5 earpieces. All right, so you can see I have stacked up all my earpieces. I'll finish pinning those in just a moment. But now I'm on my face pieces, and it's the exact same thing for the face pieces. They're just a little bit bigger. So I'll walk you through one of them. Once again, we're gonna do the face piece, let us see, wrong sides together, and press right along that midpoint on the curve. Then we're gonna grab piece D and do D right sides together and find the midpoint along its curved little edge over here. There we go. And then once again, we're gonna lay them right sides together, curves opposite one another. A frown and a mustache, but it's gonna be so happy in the end. And then we're gonna just pin at the midpoint. And then once again, we're gonna go corner to corner, flat side to flat side. So you might be like tempted to do it like this, like that. No, that's not it. That is a flat side to a curved side. We don't do that. Flat side to flat side, corner to corner, just like that, add a pin. Do the same thing on the other corner to corner and pin together. And then for this one especially, you're gonna wanna add some extra pins. Now, depending on the size you're making, this is a size small, so I can easily just add 1 pin between the midpoint and the edge pins. But if you're making the medium or the large, I would suggest you add multiple pins because you really wanna stretch this out and wrap that piece D so that it can connect to every edge. I wouldn't say that the bigger ones are any harder. You just need to add a couple more pins. So let's see, I'll add just a couple pins to this one too. See, just like that. And when I pull it and stretch it, it flattens out neatly, just in that section. It's funny because if you work with bags, you're really used to working with 3-dimensional seams, you know, where things don't lay flat because it's a bag, it's not supposed to be flat. But with quilts, we're creating pretty much a 3-dimensional object right now that we're going to turn into a 2-dimensional object. So this is very tricky for quilters, I found. It was tricky for me when I was learning why I had to create. I couldn't wrap my head around if this should be flat or not. I kept thinking that at this stage, when it's like this, it should be perfectly flat like every other part of the quilt block. But it's not supposed to be. It should be not flat. It is 3-dimensional. But we're gonna make it flat in just a minute. So you see all these extra pins I'm adding? So there's my face piece all pinned up. So I'm gonna do that with the other face piece as well. All right, so now I have 8 little bits here all ready to be sewn. Now let's talk about a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance real quick. Scant 1/4 inch seam allowance means just barely a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So it's not like, it's not an 1/8 of an inch smaller. It's not a 1/16 of an inch smaller. It's just next to it. Look at the pattern where I have a diagram to show how it is. It's just kissing it. So here's the thing. If you're new to quilting, don't worry about it. Just do a 1/4 inch seam allowance when you sew this, okay? Don't do bigger than a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's the worst thing you can do. If you go bigger, even just a little bit bigger than a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're gonna have a lot of problems because the blocks won't be big enough. Now, for this block here, you're safe because these blocks are gonna end up bigger than they need to be. And I'll show you that in just a minute. It is designed that way, all right? These blocks are meant to be larger than we need them because we're gonna trim them down. So when quilting, I highly suggest having a scrap piece of material that is going to be your leader. So that means I'm gonna run this scrap piece under the sewing machine first, and I'm going to just run it under the needle, let it hang off the back, and then I'm gonna slowly feed each one of these one by one in a chain. It's called chain stitching. This allows us to sew without having to worry about the thread getting tangled up in the bottom, without having to worry about these really delicate, lightweight corners of material getting sucked into the bottom of the machine. It happens to the best of us. Chain stitching is key with quilting. And so always having a piece of just scrap material that you run under the needle first and then you start putting the rest after it is really helpful. So I'm gonna go through every single one of these. 1/4 inch seam allowance, scant if you prefer, either one of those is fine. No back stitching. If you're worried about your threads kind of coming undone at the corners here, you can change your stitch length to a 2mm stitch length, but I'm going to be sewing at a 2.5mm stitch length. So the hardest part is always starting this corner over here. So my suggestion, I would never recommend sewing over needles, but you can start sewing a little bit on that corner and then remove your pin. And you need to make sure you're using a stiletto here and just kind of gently pull that top piece over so that it lines up with the bottom piece. And I'm always sewing with the background piece wrong side up. I never sew with the inner curved piece right side up. It should always be that frame piece. So if you're doing any sort of other quilt block where it uses these types of curves, you want the frame side to be wrong side up when you're sewing, because that's the one that needs to stretch to go around that curve. So you can see I'm just pulling it edge to edge, and then once you get close to the very end here, just use your stiletto to kind of tug it to get it to line up corner to corner. But remember that we are going to be trimming this down, so if it doesn't line up perfectly, like my corners here are struggling to line up perfectly, that's okay. This is all going to get cut off anyways. So as you saw at the machine, and as I mentioned while I was there, I always sew with the outer piece of the block wrong side up. So this is a very common block, but you always will have this inner rounded piece and the outer rounded piece. I'm going to call that the frame, okay? I always sew with the frame wrong side up. Don't sew with the inner part wrong side up. If someone tells you to, I mean, go for it if you want to try it. It's not a good idea. Just like when we sew gussets, okay? When we make a bag and we sew a gusset, we don't sew with the main panel wrong side up. We sew with the gusset wrong side up, because the gusset, the outer part, the frame, is what needs to stretch. So we need to see that, and we need to be pulling on it to get it where we want it, okay? The bottom part, the inner part, the main panel, that is gonna just stay flat. That's normal. The gusset's what we need to manipulate. Does that make sense? Okay. So now let's flatten these suckers out. So I like to press the seam behind the ear. So I'm going to just kind of pull this out. If you want to give the seam a little press first, you can, but I wouldn't suggest it. I would just use your fingers first and get this rounded bit pressed. And you see the seam on the back here is behind the ear. I do suggest you always have it behind the inner part. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go around and give it a press. There we go. And then I'm going to press it on the back as well. And now, if you want to use some steam here, but you don't want to use steam in your iron, you can grab your mister, give it a little mist, flatten it out, and give it a little press. There we go. You see how cute that is? Now, let me just show you. When we started out, our pattern pieces were pretty rectangular except for the curve. This is nowhere near a square. This is not a nice rectangle. This is why we don't cut them to the finished size and sew them together and just hope to be perfect. This is not perfect. We make this bigger. This is a bigger block than what we need it to be. Here is the finished block, and when I lay this over, see, we have a lot of overhang. It's helpful, okay? I know it's probably way more than we need, but it's really helpful. When we trim it down, we're gonna have a perfect square. It's gonna be perfect. So do this for all of your ear and face pieces. Even with the face piece, I always have the seam go behind the inner rounded bit, not the frame. All right, so now we're gonna trim down our blocks. So first, I'm gonna show you how to do it with a ruler, and then I'm gonna show you how to do it with the template. So I'm gonna tell you the finished size for this ear block is gonna be 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches for the size small, okay? The face block is a different size. All the other ear blocks for the medium and the large are different sizes. But I'm gonna tell you for this one, it's 2.5 by 2.5 inches. If you're using a ruler, here's what you wanna do. You wanna line up the top bit of the curve and the side bit of the curve. See how I have it angled like this? The top and the side, you wanna line those up with 1/4 inch tick marks, all right? So, let me see if I can, I'm gonna try to zoom in the camera for you so maybe you guys can see it better. I'm looking at the top here and I have my 1/4 inch tick mark from the top edge, and I want that to line up with the seam between the background and the ear. And then over here on the right, I'm gonna move this over because I want the 1/4 inch tick mark to line up with the seam between the ear and the background over here as well. And so you might find that when you do that, this kind of twists. So the goal is to get the 1/4 inch tick mark up here and the 1/4 inch tick mark on the side to both line up with the seam. You see what I'm saying? Over here, 1/4 inch is lined up with the seam. On the top, the 1/4 inch is lined up with the seam. The next thing you want to check is that the edges go past the 2.5 inch marks. So 1, 2.5, here's my 2.5 inch mark. My seam goes past it, that's good. 1, 2.5 on the bottom, my edge of my block goes past it, that's good. So this is how we want it to be. Again, 1/4 inch marks on the top and the side are lined up with the seams, all right? And depending on your block size, if your block size needed to be 3.5 inches, then you would just do it for 3.5 inches. But no matter what size the block is, it's always about the 1/4 inch marks, okay? Every time. So now I'm gonna trim down the side and the top, all right? Okay, now I'm gonna move my ruler to the side. I'm gonna rotate this 180 degrees, just like that. This is the edge here that I just trimmed. Right here on the left and the bottom, that's what I ended up just trimming down. And I'm gonna line up my ruler so that the 2.5 inch mark lines up with the side, the 2.5 inch mark lines up with the bottom. Now I'm not so concerned with lining up 1/4 inch marks. I just know that in the end, this block needs to be 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches, and that's the edge that I've already trimmed. And now I'm gonna trim the other corner. And now I have a perfect 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch square that is perfectly rounded with just enough material on the edges. And there we go. So if you're not using the acrylic templates, that's how you're gonna cut this out using a ruler. Now, if you are using the acrylic templates, all you have to do is lay it over your block. You see the acrylic templates have a marking for the curve. So you're just gonna lay it over your block so that everything lines up, the curve lines up, the connection on the bottom corner and the top left corner, those all line up. It completely covers your block. Carefully keep it steady while you trim down all 4 edges. And if you need to pivot this to make it easier, go ahead and do that. They're both very simple methods. If you just are really comfortable with rulers, then that's gonna be the method you should use. If you prefer templates, then that's it. And you could also not use your rotary cutter. You could just lay this over. Here, I'll show you. You can just lay this over your block that's uncut, match it up, and then you can grab a marker and you can just trace your template if you prefer around, and then use scissors to cut it. Whatever is easiest for you, whatever is easiest. And on all sizes of the blocks, these curved combo pieces are squares. So there's no worry about making sure that you got the rounded bit in the right spot or anything like that. They're all squares. All right, once you're done with the ears, make sure you don't use the same size for the face. Okay, if you're using templates, make sure you grab the bigger of the checkpoint templates and use that. And if you're using a ruler, make sure you check the pattern for what this size is supposed to be. All right, there you go. Now all these pieces are prepped, and I'll say that is the most time-consuming part of this entire block. It's not even that hard, it's just really time-consuming. But once you've got it done, now we can put this quilt together just like any other quilt block. So let's lay it all out. Remember, if you have directional print, think about that. And if you took a picture of where you wanted everything, get your picture out and get everything laid out perfectly. I'm gonna grab the rest of my pattern pieces here. So my E blocks are gonna go inside the ear just like this. You should start seeing it all come together now. My F blocks go in the center between the ears. I love laying quilt blocks out like this. It's so fun. And then I have my G blocks that are gonna go right above these 2 face pieces. And then my H blocks go on the side, just like that. So I like to piece things all together. So I'm not gonna walk through each thing separately. We're gonna do it in a lot of chunks. So just go with the flow here. Let's actually start with just the top. We'll just start with the top part and then we'll do the bottom part just to make it not too complicated for you guys. So let's start with the top. Left ear over here. Make sure you get your ears lined up. You don't, want to end up sewing it like this. So get everything the way you want it. Grab your pins and let's start from left to right. So my left ear pieces that are roundy are gonna flip right sides together, and make sure you match up the seam. Okay, so the seam here on the side, Make sure you match that up. That's gonna make sure that everything looks smooth in the end. If these aren't matched up, you're gonna have a bit of a like disconnect, which is not that big of a deal. You would have to look closely to see the problem, but you already went through all this work to get these perfectly shaped. Just line up those seams. Okay, the next combo is a curvy bit in a square. Lining those, there's no seams to line up. Just make sure you line up corner to corner perfectly. They should be the exact same size. All right, same thing with our two center blocks. We're gonna lay those right sides together and pin along their connecting edge. And then we're gonna take the right ear combo with the curve and the just no curve, just square. And we're going to line these up. Again, these two are the exact same size, so make sure it's perfectly corner to corner, edge to edge. And then finally, the last two curvy bits, right sides together, lining up the seams on the side as best as you can so that it turns out nice and smooth, but also corner to corner. These should line up perfectly. Again, we trimmed them down to be perfect. All right, so now I'm gonna take all of these units to the sewing machine and I'm gonna sew them at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once again, if you'd prefer to just do a regular 1/4 inch seam allowance, that's fine. Just no bigger. And make sure you use your leader scrap piece of material and just run these under the machine one by one. So now what we're gonna do is press all these seams open. So I like to lay my unit sewn right sides together, wrong sides out. Press along the seam real quick once with the iron and then do a gentle finger press. Press along the seam again, and then we're going to press open all these seams. So we're gonna go to the back here, carefully take your fingers, press it open. Doing those like initial press with the iron just warms up that seam and makes it easier for us to get it the way we want. You can also use some steam if you prefer, and just hold the iron down for a couple seconds. Flip it to the right side, hold the iron down for a couple seconds, and it'll give you a really flat seam. So do this for all of your units you just sewed, pressing the seam open on all of them, even the curvy ones. Everything gets its seams pressed open here. Alrighty, now remake your blocks. They go like this. And again, get your photo out if you had a specific direction. There we go. And now we're just gonna keep combining them. So we're gonna start with the left ear over here, and we're going to lay them right sides together. These center seams need to be matched up perfectly and pin together. These are two pieces for the left ear that are right sides together. And then match up the curved part of the seam on the top and pin that together. And then match up the bottom corners. And then you can add a couple extra pins in between if you'd like. And then we do the same thing on the right ear. So I'm leaving the center piece alone, but just flipping the right ear pieces right sides together and lining them up on the center seam first. And then lining up the top curved seams next. And then lining up the bottom corners. And then if you need to add any more pins, go ahead and do that. Okay, now let's go back to the sewing machine and sew along these pinned edges at a scant or just 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, once you have those sewn together, just like we did before, we're gonna press those seams open once again. I know we have a lot of combinations here, but we do still wanna press the seams open. And for these kind of bulky seams, I do like to use a bit of steam or starch. And just do your best not to stretch the block. You're just trying to keep it nice and flat. So do this with both ears. It's coming together so nicely. All right, so now let's attach the middle piece. So lay your ears out just like you want them in the end, like that. And I'm gonna start with the left side over here, and I'm gonna take our middle section and lay it right sides together with the right side of the left ear, and then match up the seams. There we go. And then match up the corners. You don't have any curved seams that need to be matched up here, but you do want the edges and the corners to all match up. And if you find that some of these things are not the right size, they're not lining up correctly, check the pattern. I have sizes for each step of the block, so you can double check. So now I'm gonna go sew along this pinned edge at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once that's sewn on, just press that seam open, and then grab your right ear and lay your right ear right side down with that center block, matching up the seams and pinning together, right sides together. And then you can go and sew along that pinned edge at a scant or regular 1/4 inch seam allowance. I would go more with a scant at this point since our seams are getting a little bulky. All right, once you have it sewn together, grab your iron and just press that seam open. Alrighty, there you go. There's the top of your block. I have the measurements for the finished size of this in the pattern, so if you want to double check it, you can. You can grab a ruler, trim it down, clean it up. But that's the top part. Now let's do the bottom part. So just like we did with the top, let's lay out the bottom. There's fewer seams here though. So we have the bottom curved bit, that's the bottom of the face, this little rectangle that goes above it, and then the sides. So we're gonna start with the inner pieces first. You're going to take the bottom part of your face on the left side and the rectangle, which is pattern piece G, on the top, and lay them right sides together along the top of your head piece or face piece. Grab your pins and pin along this top edge. And now let's sew along these top 2 pinned edges at a scant or regular 1/4 inch seam allowance. And once you have those sewn, press those seam allowances open, just like you've done on the top section. Pressing seam allowances open is important because it helps reduce bulk and it allows our seams to line up neater. It's not always necessary to press them open, but when you have a lot of seams coming together made up of a lot of seams. So for example, when this gets sewn on, that's going to be another seam that's connected to another seam here. You know what I mean? That starts to get really bulky if you don't press the seam open. So I know it can be difficult sometimes, but it is really helpful. Alrighty, lay your blocks out again. There we go. And now we're just going to work on side by side. So split them into half, and then you're going to have your H piece over here on the left and then the left side of your face, and lay them right sides together along this left edge and use pins to pin together. You don't have any specific seams you need to match up here, but they do need to match up corner to corner. Once again, block measurements for these completed pieces are in the pattern if you want to double check your size. And now take both these to the sewing machine and sew along both edges at a 1/4 inch or scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Whatever you've been doing, just keep doing that. Now grab your iron, and you don't have to press these ones open. Look at me, I'm so nice. You can just press the seam behind the H rectangles. That's just the basic rectangle that doesn't have any other seams on it. You can just press the seam behind that. We are going to be sewing this one more time, but I find leaving this seam going one way is fine. If you prefer to open it though, go ahead and press it open. That is a great idea too. All right, now lay out this bottom just like this. And we're going to just pull these right sides together along that center seam. Grab your pins and make sure you line up the seams first. So the seams are not in the very center of this edge, but you do want to line up those seams before you line up everything else. And then after you have the seams lined up, go corner to corner. And then on the bottom here, that's also another one. You want to line up the curved seams together, because that's where you will notice if they don't match up. All right, now let's go sew along this pinned edge at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Alrighty, now let's press that seam open. This one, it is best if you have it open. So just carefully give it a press on the front, flip it over, spray it a bit on the back, or use steam in your iron, and then press that seam open. Pressing seams open is also really great if you do plan to make a quilt and you're going to quilt this in the end, because it does result in thinner seams, which makes it easier for long arm quilters to quilt it, or just if you're gonna, especially if you're gonna quilt it on a domestic machine, it makes it easier to do the quilting over it and not so many big bumps everywhere. All right, your bottom piece is now done. Let's grab the top piece, and all we have to do is flip them together. So one trick, you do have something that needs to match up. You see this little bump right here? You want the bottom of the ears to match up down here. If they don't, you're going to have a little gap, kind of like this, like a tiny gap. It's not the end of the world, but it's not the look we're going for. So here's what we're gonna do. First, we're gonna find the midpoint along the bottom edge of the ears. So we're gonna flip this to the wrong side. We're gonna fold it in half, and we're gonna focus on the seams right around the midpoint, around that block F. And we're going to match up those seams just like that. Pinch it if you would like to use a chalk marker. That's what I'm gonna use because it's such dark fabric. I find just using an iron isn't enough. There we go. So I'm gonna line up my top with the bottom, right sides together along their connecting seam. I have a seam going down the very center on my bottom panel, and I'm gonna use that to match it up with that midpoint mark I just made on the bottom of my top panel. And I'm gonna use pins to pin those together. Okay, next thing you wanna do. See this seam over here on the left, the farthest left seam right here. We want this seam to come in to the right 1/4 of an inch from this seam here on the bottom panel. This is piece H and this is piece G. So I'm gonna grab my ruler and I'm gonna match up the 1/4 inch tick mark with that seam on that bottom panel that's between piece H and G. And then I'm gonna lay my top piece down. And this seam right here between the side of the ear and this is what, piece E? That seam is gonna match up with the very edge of my ruler, okay? And that way I know that my seam on the top here is 1/4 of an inch in from that seam on the bottom. Now pin around that, and then you can pin off to the corner. If they don't line up perfectly corner to corner, that's okay. You can always trim up this block later. So we're gonna do the same thing on the other side. I'm gonna walk you through it. So I'm gonna lift up my top panel here. And here I have the connecting seam between piece G and piece H. I'm gonna grab my ruler and I'm gonna have that seam line up with the 1/4 inch mark so that the 0 inch part of my ruler is over here to the left of that seam. And then I'm gonna lay the top panel down and the seam all the way here on the right between piece E and my ear should line up right with the edge of the ruler. Okay, the next step to ensure this all goes according to plan is you wanna sew this with the top panel wrong side up. That needs to be number 1, top panel wrong side up. Then when you're sewing along this edge, once you get to that seam on the top here between the curved ear and piece E, make sure your needle goes over that seam. So I'll try to zoom in the camera a little bit. Okay, I tried to zoom in just a little bit, but you see this little bit right here where I have the background fabric on the top, the head fabric on the bottom. Right there, that connector right there, you wanna make sure your needle hits that spot, because as long as it does, you're not gonna have a gap between the bottom of the ear and the background material, okay? As long as your needle hits that intersection, you're good. Both sides, okay? So that might mean when you're sewing along this, you have to kind of increase or decrease your seam allowance just a bit at those intersections. That's okay. As long as your needle gets there, you're gonna be fine. Okay, so now we're gonna go to the sewing machine and we're gonna sew along this edge at a 1/4 inch or scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, whichever one is easier for you. Again, focusing on making sure that needle ends up in those intersection seam points. So if you find that you have a gap there, like you see how there's a little tiny gap here, you can always go back and fix that by seeing where it is, go back to that section and just sew a tiny bit further in from where you already sewed. You can do that. So now when we open it up, we don't have that gap anymore. See, you can always go back and add an extra row of stitching to that. Alrighty, your block's all done. Let's give it a press. And like I just showed you, if you open this up and you're like, dang it, there's like a big old gap right here where I see my background material, just go back in and do a little bit closer. We're not gonna open this seam, so you can do that. So I'm gonna have the seam go up behind the top panel. If you prefer it to go along the bottom panel, you can. I would suggest just having it go one way or the other, though. I wouldn't suggest pressing open this seam necessarily, because it is a bit bulky and it might be a lot of work and still close up on you. Okay, so then I'm gonna give it a press on the back. I'm gonna spray it a little bit. And I have the final measurements for this in the pattern if you need to trim down your block a bit. That's always a satisfying moment when you trim it down to size and you just have to shave off little bits here and there. And there you go. How cute is that? It's so cute. Okay, so I'm gonna add a bow to the block we just made, but it is completely optional. So if you're done, you're done. Congratulations, have fun with your block. So let's work on this bow. And now this is how I find it easiest to work with this, but you can do it however you want. If you want to trace out the bow right now and then add this is pretty much just like a double-sided glue, but it also is has a good stabilizer to it, so it prevents fraying. however you want to do this. I'm just going to cut out a piece of material that's bigger than I know it needs to be. So I'm just laying my template over the fabric and just cutting out the material just like that. And I'm going to go ahead and cut off this bit down here, the selvage. There we go. And this is still good. And now I'm going to do the same thing with this, just cutting out a piece that I know is big enough, but not too big. This stuff is, you know, a little bit pricier, but it's also really hard to cut, which is why I don't cut it to size. It's easier to cut once it's adhered to material. So it has a glue side and a paper side. We want the glue side to connect with our fabric. So I'm just gonna lay my fabric right over it, just like that. Do your best to cover it. You don't want your iron to be touching the glue side at all. So if you need to, you can trim it down even more. So then with the paper side on the bottom, the glue side on the back of your material, your fabric right side up, grab your iron and press this down. And you might need to hold it in place for a few seconds. If you have like a heat press, you can definitely use that as well. You could also use this bow applique with HTV, which is heat transfer vinyl. There's some really beautiful glittery options out there. I'm probably gonna play with that a bit too. All you have to do is trace it out. There will be SVG files as well if you'd like to use the SVG file and an automatic cutting machine to just cut it out and then just iron it on. That's easy to do as well. All right, once this is nice and pressed, we're gonna flip it over and look at the paper side. And then I'm gonna grab my template and some sort of a marking tool. I'm gonna use an air erasing marking tool, but just remember, if you trace it now, you gotta cut it, because if you don't, it's gonna disappear. And if it's hot, it's gonna disappear. So some spots might be fading quicker than other because those spots are a little bit hotter. And then once I have it traced, I'm gonna grab my scissors and I'm just gonna cut it. And I'm telling you, cutting this what is it called? Hot fix? Cutting this hot fix on its own with scissors, no matter if they're paper scissors or fabric scissors, is such a pain. It does not cut. I find it works fine with a rotary cutter, but not with scissors. But whenever it's adhered to fabric, it's very easy to cut. Now, you can probably cut this hot fix on a Cricut, but I don't know how, and I'd be a little bit worried with the paper backing sticking to it, because as you can see right now, it looks like paper right here. I'm gonna remove that soon though. That's gonna go away because it's a double-sided glue. I'm gonna glue it onto my quilt block. So I don't know how that would work with a Cricut. If you've done that before, let me know. All right, once you have that done, this is what it looks like. Now we're gonna grab our block, and each block size has its own different size for a bow. Now, the number one thing you gotta remember here is that the top edge of this block is going to be sewn into a seam. So first thing I would do is make sure you trim down your block to size. And then over here, just remember to leave a 1/4 inch. Leave the bow at least a 1/4 of an inch below it. So I'm just gonna put my ruler there. I don't want this to go above the edge because then it's just gonna get sewn into a seam. So what I'm gonna do is peel the paper off of this. As long as it's adhered really well to your fabric, it should come right off. There we go. And see, now the back of the fabric's all shiny and it's not gonna fray, which is cool. So then I'm just going to kind of eyeball this, center my bow, make sure it's nice and lower than that 1/4 inch seam allowance. I think that looks pretty good. And then once I'm happy with it, material right side up, I'm just gonna press it down. You can use a heat press here or an iron. You just do wanna hold it for a few seconds. If you're not planning on top stitching this down, then definitely press it really, really well. I am gonna top stitch it, but I'm gonna switch my thread because I do not like that thin thread being used with top stitching. It's not very cute. It's a little too wiry for me. You could always hand stitch this down as well after you adhere it like this. If you like to do hand quilting and hand stitching, you can definitely use your hand quilting thread and hand stitch this down, but I'm not going to. But I am gonna use this thread. This is a Tex 35 weight thread, color Strawberry Shortcake from Wizardry Stitchery. It is thicker. It is a bag making thread, and it is thicker than the construction thread, but it should still work with my 7010 needle. And I'm gonna use this and I'm gonna top stitch along all the edges of this bow at about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm gonna leave the threads long. I'm not gonna back stitch at the beginning and the end, so threads stay nice and long at the beginning and the end, and then I'll tie them off on the back and the end. Oh man, doesn't that look so good? It looks so good. I love this block. It's so fun. Okay, I'm gonna flip it over. What you want to do now, you see I left the tails nice and long. The tails are the threads, right? So this is the top thread that I showed you, and this is the bobbin thread. I'm just gonna gently tug on the bobbin thread until I see the top thread looping back here, and then I'm gonna use my stiletto to pull it back. Do the same thing with the other bobbin thread, looping that top thread to the back. And then once I have all 4 threads here, if you look to the front, see, it's like you can't even tell where the stitching starts and stops. That's the look we want. We don't want any back stitching. We don't want any kind of gunky bits, you know? We want it to look seamless. Beautiful. Love this. Okay, and then I'm just going to tie these into 3 knots. So I just divvy them up 2 and 2 and do 3 nice tight knots. Shouldn't have to worry about any tension being put on these. And then just trim down that thread. And there we go. We got our little mouse blocks, our little magical mouse, little mices, little magical mice blocks. I don't know. These are cute. These are fun. I hope you enjoy making them. I sure do. And she's cute. And she's so cute. Isn't that bow just perfect? Look at these two. It's just so fun. And isn't that hot fix, whatever that stuff is, isn't that great? If you haven't purchased that before, I do suggest you grab some. I think it'll last a long time. I don't think it's something you're gonna run out of quickly. I know that it's an extra expense, but it's so useful for something like this. And it's just a nice thing to have, because even with bag making, there might be a time where you wanna use quilt cotton as an applique, and you have the ability to do that. You don't have to worry about finding that print in a vinyl or something. Like, you can just use the quilt cotton. It's fine. So I hope you love making this block as much as I do. If you make these blocks and you share them on social media, please make sure you tag me. I'm OklaRoots, literally everywhere. I want to see them. I want to make 1,000 more. Now, for my bag makers, or if you're a quilter and you're like, okay, I know how to quilt. Like, this wasn't challenging at all, but now what are we going to do with it? Because like I said, this is a quilt block pattern, not a quilt pattern. We're going to use these in some bags. That's right. These 2 are going to be used. I don't know yet in what. We're definitely going to make an awesome tote bag with the medium. And the large, I don't know. I might have to do a proper quilt out of that one. I'm really interested in playing with the colors of all these blocks and doing something really fun. And that would just be perfect too. So for us, we like to vacation down in Orlando a lot, and we always bring our own blankets with us. My kids like to use them in the car. No matter how hot it is here in Florida, they always like to have their blankets in the car. And then also, like, when we're in the room, sometimes the air conditioners are blasting and the blankets that the rooms provide are not great. So we always bring our own quilts, blankets, things like that. This quilt block would be a perfect one to use to create some travel quilts for when we're, you know, traveling, maybe going on a cruise or something. I don't know, but we're going to turn that one into a quilt for sure. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a great day. Have a fantastic rest of your week. Get out there and make something. Bye, guys.